The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
At 78, Benny Andersson stands as a figure, both timeless and quietly burdened by the weight of an era. As one of the legendary architects of ABBA sound, his name is etched into the very fabric of pop music history, and his melodies have danced through the lives of millions across decades. Yet, behind the endless applause and shimmering accolades lies a man whose personal journey is far more complex than the glittering stage persona might suggest. For years, whispers of a deeper truth about Benny's life have swirled in the shadows of his public image, stories of reflection, reconciliation, and the cost of fame. And now, in his later years, as the world watches with bated breath, Benny Andersson has finally spoken of what we all suspected, but never dared to fully understand. The silence he's kept for so long may now offer more than just answers. It could be the closing of a long, silent chapter. Benny Andersson's life began far from the dazzling lights of international stages, within the quiet streets of Stockholm. Born to a modest family, his early years were shaped by the hum of a city, its rhythms ordinary to the untrained ear but rich with the promise of something more. Music, however, was never ordinary for Benny. From a young age, the sound of a piano drew him in, a magnetic force that slowly began to define his destiny. The child who once wandered the cold streets of Stockholm now found his purpose in the warmth of melody. His music was an escape, a portal to a world beyond the ordinary confines of his upbringing. It was in those moments, fingers dancing across the keys, that the foundation for something extraordinary began to take shape. As Benny grew, so too did his command over music. He was no longer just a boy with a passion for sound, but a seasoned musician with an innate understanding of how to shape emotion through chords. By the time he formed the group that would become ABBA, Benny was already a force within the Swedish music scene. The band, born from the union of his musical genius and the talents of fellow band members, soon found its place in the world. Yet it was not just talent that made ABBA sound distinctive, it was their blend of infectious melodies, their anthemic choruses, and an almost indescribable energy that enveloped the listener. The world began to listen. The rise of ABBA was swift, its success undeniable. Their music echoed through stadiums, and their faces were plastered across magazine covers. Behind the colorful costumes, the synchronized dances, and the thrilling music, however, lay a truth not often seen by the public eye. For Benny Andersson, this success was not simply the fulfillment of a dream, it was the beginning of a journey laced with unimaginable pressure. As the world embraced the joyful sound of ABBA, Benny felt the weight of something far darker. The man who had created music that made millions dance was now trapped in a machine that demanded more than he could give. His personal life, his peace, his solitude all became casualties of the fame he had long sought. But with fame came something more than they had bargained for: the cost of being immortalized in the public eye. As ABBA fame soared across the globe, it did so with the unrelenting speed of a wildfire, leaving an indelible mark on every city, every corner of the world they touched. Benny Andersson, once a quiet composer in Stockholm, now found himself thrust into the center of a storm. There was a magic to their music, a vitality that swept fans off their feet and transported them into a world of glittering escapism. Their tours were spectacles of euphoria, their hits written into the very fabric of pop culture. The world seemed to celebrate them as living legends, their music playing through every radio and filling every dance floor. But beneath the euphoric highs and the glittering accolades, Benny felt the weight of something far heavier. The relentless pressure of maintaining the image of ABBA flawless, unstoppable, an emblem of joy and perfection began to gnaw at him. Each performance, each public appearance, demanded a piece of his soul. The intense scrutiny of the public eye, the ceaseless whispers of the media, and the endless demands of their touring schedule began to erode the personal peace he had once known. Gone were the quiet moments spent in reflection, the serenity of a life that was his own. Instead, there was only the constant hum of cameras, the flashing lights, and the ever-present expectations to remain larger than life. As the band became more beloved, Benny felt increasingly invisible within it. Behind the brilliant piano and the infectious rhythm of their music, there was a man quietly unraveling. The pressure to remain perfect, the constant travel, the grueling schedule, all of it began to fracture the sense of self that Benny had once held dear. No longer was music his escape, but the very thing that defined him in the eyes of the world. What had once been a joy, an expression of his deepest self, began to feel like a trap. The man who had poured his heart into every song now found himself suffocated by the weight of his own creation. Despite the outward appearance of unshakable success, there was an emotional toll that no one could see. Benny's personal battles, his internal struggles, remained hidden from the adoring public. He had become the face of ABBA, but in doing so, had lost his place in his own life. The joy of creating music, the freedom he had once found in his craft, had become something distant, something he could no longer reach. The pressure was relentless, and as he would later reveal, the toll it took on him would only deepen as the years wore on, dragging him further from the man he had once been. But even as ABBA's star burned brighter, the cracks in their perfect facade were beginning to show. As the fame of ABBA surged to unimaginable heights, the world seemed to exist only in the reflection of their stardom. Their music echoed across continents, their faces appeared on the covers of every magazine, and the band became a symbol of global joy and unity. Yet beneath the surface of the glittering success lay a much darker, quieter reality. For Benny Andersson, the cost of this success was borne not by the audience who adored him, but by those closest to him, the people whose love had once been his foundation. The constant touring, the public's relentless scrutiny, and the ceaseless demands of being part of one of the world's most beloved musical acts began to strain every part of his personal life. The very thing that had brought him into the light now cast long, unforgiving shadows. Relationships that once seemed unshakable, built on years of trust and companionship, were tested by the constant pressure of living under the microscope. For Benny, this strain was perhaps most painfully felt in his marriage to fellow band member Agnetha Faltskog. What was once a partnership of shared dreams and mutual support slowly unraveled in the face of the constant upheaval of their lives in the spotlight. At the beginning of their union, Benny and Agnetha were not just bandmates, they were a living symbol of love and unity, both on and off the stage. Their connection seemed unbreakable, a partnership that seemed destined to endure. But as ABBA fame grew, so did the pressures that came with it. The long hours on the road, the public's insatiable curiosity, the constant demands of their careers, all began to pull them in different directions. The love they had once shared became overshadowed by the weight of their fame, and the space between them grew. Their marriage, once a safe haven, began to feel like a fragile structure, cracking under the weight of the public eye. For Benny, the pain of this personal disintegration was profound. The emotional toll of watching something so precious slip away, unable to be held together despite every effort, left a wound that would never fully heal. It was not just the loss of a relationship, but the loss of an ideal, the loss of the very thing that had once anchored him in a world that was now spinning uncontrollably around him. In the silence of their split, Benny found himself retreating more and more into his music, his only refuge from the chaos. The notes that once carried joy now carried sorrow, a quiet confession that spoke of his inner turmoil. Despite the outward appearance of success, the sold-out concerts, the millions of records sold, the adulation of millions, Benny's internal world was in turmoil. His music, the very thing that had once brought him solace, had become both his shield and his prison. The joy that ABBA music brought to the world was often overshadowed by the internal conflicts and personal pain that Benny carried with him. As the years passed, the public saw only the perfection of the performances, the smiles, the synchronized movements, the music that spoke of happiness. What they did not see, what Benny could never fully reveal, was the cost of that perfection, the emotional toll it took on his soul, the isolation that crept in as he became more and more disconnected from the world around him. The complexity of his relationships, once vibrant and full of promise, became mired in misunderstandings and unspoken pain. Benny's retreat into his music was not just a creative choice, but a necessary escape. It was in the quiet of the studio, the solitude of composition, that he could find a semblance of peace. Yet even here, the weight of his sacrifices, the toll of the life he had chosen, remained. His music was no longer just an expression of joy, it was a reflection of the sacrifices he had made, the relationships he had lost, and the man he had become. As the years passed, the weight of the personal sacrifices Benny had made began to take its toll in ways he had not anticipated. After the disbandment of ABBA in the early 1980s, the world expected to hear more from Benny Andersson. The Swedish pop sensation that had captivated millions, the composer behind some of the most unforgettable melodies of a generation, had seemingly vanished from the spotlight. The cameras that had once followed him so closely now no longer flashed in his direction, and the stage that had once felt like a home grew distant, as if it never truly belonged to him. To the public, Benny's absence was seen as a retreat, a choice to live a life out of the reach of the fame that had once defined him. Yet this was not a man hiding from the world, but a man lost within himself, trying to piece together a life that had been shattered by the very fame that had given him everything. The fame that had once lifted him now felt like a cage. The brilliance of ABBA's success, the accolades, the attention, the adoration had come at an unimaginable cost, and Benny was left to confront the wreckage of a life lived under the relentless glare of the public eye. He had given so much of himself to ABBA, to the music that had brought joy to millions, but in doing so he had lost sight of the man behind the piano. Without the band, without the fame, Benny found himself adrift in a sea of uncertainty. His identity, once so intricately tied to the melodies of ABBA, was now something unrecognizable, something he could no longer understand. During this time, Benny retreated into the quiet world of solo projects, seeking refuge in music once again. But unlike the exuberant energy that had filled ABBA sound, his music now carried with it the weight of unspoken regret. The joy and celebration that had once flowed through his fingers now seemed like ghosts, their echoes more haunting than uplifting. His music, which had been the lifeblood of an era, became his only means of grappling with the emotions that he could no longer express in words. There was no longer an audience to cheer for him, no crowd to sway to the rhythm of his creations. Instead, there was only silence. And in that silence, Benny found himself not hiding, but confronting the painful truths of his own soul. This period was one of profound personal reflection. Away from the cameras, away from the frenetic energy of ABBA global success, Benny faced the deep, uncomfortable truths about his own desires, his regrets, and the consequences of a life lived in the public eye. The man who had once filled stadiums with his music was now retreating from the world, seeking solace in the quiet corners of his own mind. In the isolation that followed ABBA disbandment, Benny was no longer the idol the world adored. He was simply a man trying to make sense of the pieces of a life that had, at times, been too much to carry. Yet even as he withdrew from the world, his music continued to be the thread that kept him connected to himself. Through the piano keys, he spoke the words he could no longer say aloud, telling the story of a man who had given everything for the sound of joy, only to be left with the silence of his own soul. It was in this space between the notes and the quiet that Benny began to find something deeper, something more lasting than the fleeting fame of his past. But the silence he embraced would soon give way to a revelation, one that would change everything. Benny Andersson's return to the public eye was not the grand spectacle that many might have anticipated. It was not a revival filled with press conferences, eager fanfare, or red carpets. Instead, it was marked by something far quieter, a deep, profound acceptance. There was no yearning to recapture the grandeur of the past, no effort to chase the fleeting brilliance of ABBA fame. It was as though Benny had reached a point in his life where he no longer needed to be defined by the shadow of his former band. His journey, he had come to realize, was more than just the music, more than the performances that once captured the world's gaze. It was a journey of growth, of personal reckoning, and of finding peace with the life he had led. Over the years, Benny continued to create music, but he did so in a different way. The frenetic energy of ABBA, the commercial success that once defined him, had been replaced by something far more introspective. In the solitude of his later years, he sought out projects not for the accolades or the applause, but for the joy of creation itself. He collaborated with others, worked in the background, but always with the quiet understanding that he was no longer chasing the same kind of fame that had once consumed him. The music he now created was more personal, more reflective of the man he had become. As time passed, Benny grew to reconcile with the legacy he had built, with the band that had once been his everything. When ABBA was brought up in conversation, it no longer stirred the same feelings of regret that it once had. It was no longer a painful reminder of what had been lost. Instead, Benny began to view it with a sense of acceptance. ABBA had been a chapter in his life, one that had shaped him in ways both beautiful and painful, but it was just that, a chapter. The music, the success, the adoration of millions, it was all part of the tapestry that had woven together the man he had become. He no longer needed to hold on to the pain of the past, nor the yearning for something that could never be recreated. The world, however, had moved on. The music industry had long since shifted its focus, and the fame that once enveloped ABBA seemed like a distant memory. The true price of ABBA's success, the toll it had taken on Benny personally, had largely been forgotten by the public. The world saw only the surface, the songs, the albums, the faces on the magazine covers, and not the man beneath it all, struggling to find peace. But Benny, now more at peace with his past than ever before, was ready to share the hidden truth that had silently sat with him all these years. It was not a confession born of bitterness or regret, but of quiet understanding. Benny was ready to step forward, not as the man he had been, but as the man he had become. In the calm of his later years, Benny found himself at last willing to speak of the silent burden he had carried for so long. He had lived in the shadow of ABBA for decades, but now he was ready to step into the light of his own truth. And with this final revelation, Benny Andersson stepped into the final stage of his legacy, one where silence at last was his greatest truth. After decades of silence, Benny Andersson's words seemed to echo from a distant past, as if they had been carefully kept within him, protected by the weight of a lifetime spent under the public's unblinking gaze. For years, he had chosen to speak only through the music that had made ABBA a global phenomenon, allowing the melodies to tell the story of his life, his joy, his struggles, and his triumphs. But now, in his later years, Benny felt the need to speak directly, to unveil the truths that had remained hidden beneath the surface of his public persona. No longer content to be defined solely by the music, he began to reflect on the cost of the fame that had defined him for so long. Benny's confession was not born from regret, but rather from a deep understanding of the price he had paid for the life he had lived. Fame, as he would admit, had been both a blessing and a curse, a gilded cage that offered the world's adulation, yet left him trapped in a constant state of isolation. The very thing that had once brought him joy, that had elevated him to heights few could ever imagine, had also taken from him the parts of himself he could never regain. The isolation he had experienced, even in the midst of thousands of adoring fans, was a pain that never quite dissipated. For all the praise, for all the accolades, Benny had been alone in ways that the public could never fully comprehend. His relationships, once stable and nurturing, had fractured under the immense pressure of a life lived constantly in the spotlight. The world had watched as his marriage to Agnetha Faltskog crumbled, and while the public attributed it to countless reasons, Benny knew the true cause lay in the emotional strain that ABBA's success had placed on them both. It was a price he had never fully understood until much later, after the damage had been done. Through all of this, Benny had chosen to retreat into his music, using it as both a shield and a refuge from the emotional chaos that swirled around him. Music had always been the one constant in his life, the one place where he could make sense of the world, where the turmoil inside him could be translated into something beautiful. But even as he poured his soul into every note, he could not escape the deeper truths that he had spent so many years avoiding. His fame had brought him joy, but it had also brought a profound sense of emptiness, an emptiness that only grew more apparent as the years went by. Now, with the passage of time and the distance from ABBA peak, Benny found himself at peace with his past. He no longer felt the need to hide behind the music, to let the melodies speak for him. He was ready to share the full truth of his experience, not as an apology, but as an honest reflection on the journey he had taken. Fame had shaped him, but it had also taken from him in ways he had not fully understood. His confession was not one of regret, but of recognition that the pursuit of happiness, both for himself and for the world, had come at a higher price than he had ever imagined. As he looked back on the legacy of ABBA, Benny was able to acknowledge the complexities of fame. There were pleasures, of course, the joy of creating something that resonated so deeply with so many, the excitement of standing in front of a crowd that worshipped them, the thrill of knowing their music would endure. But there were also the darker undercurrents, the loneliness, the personal sacrifices, the emotional toll that came with living in the public eye. Benny no longer saw the success of ABBA through rose-colored glasses, but as something that had both lifted him and broken him in equal measure. Benny's story, though now told, would leave a legacy far deeper than the music he had created. In the twilight of his life, Benny Andersson's legacy no longer hinges on the complexities of fame or the weight of the struggles that once defined his public persona. The world remembers him as it remembers ABBA for the music, the infectious tunes, the anthems of a generation, the melodies that continue to echo through time. But beneath the glittering surface of fame, there lies a man who, despite the sacrifices and the personal turmoil, gave the world a gift that transcended the transient nature of success. His songs, once the soundtrack to fleeting moments of joy, have now become the backdrop to the lives of countless people, weaving into the fabric of memories that will endure long after the applause has faded. Benny's music was never merely entertainment, it was something more profound. It became the soundtrack of love, of loss, of celebration and heartache, a mirror to the emotions that reside in every human soul. His melodies, simple in their construction yet deep in their emotional resonance, captured the essence of what it means to be human. And through these melodies, Benny was able to leave behind more than just notes and lyrics. He left a piece of himself in every chord, every pause, every cadence. Though Benny had spent years grappling with the weight of his own fame and the personal toll it had taken, time had granted him a deeper understanding of his journey. The struggles that once defined him were no longer seen through the lens of regret. Instead, he began to view them as integral to the music he had created. His pain, his solitude, his quiet battles, they had all been translated into something beautiful, something lasting. The music, which had once been a refuge from his own inner world, now stood as a testament to his endurance, his survival, and his ability to make something meaningful out of the chaos that had surrounded him. As Benny continued to create in his later years, it was not for the acclaim or the adoration of the masses, but for something more intimate, a deeper connection to his own soul. His final works, though less known to the public than the songs of ABBA, carried the same quiet power, the same ability to touch the heart in ways that words alone could not. These songs were not born from the need to recapture the past, but from the peace he had finally found within himself. The final melody of Benny Andersson's life, however, was not one of sadness or regret, but of acceptance and peace. It was the quiet resolution of a man who had lived a life of extremes, who had known both the heights of glory and the depths of personal loss, yet had found a way to live with both. His legacy, wrapped in the music of ABBA and his own solo creations, is a testament to the human spirit, resilient, complex, and, above all, enduring. And so, Benny Andersson's life and legacy will forever echo in the hearts of those who have heard the music, in the silence between the notes.